Okay, welcome. So, this is our first video lecture, and these are lectures on North America. There are 3 of them. This is for 8th grade, and the lectures will each last no more than 40 minutes. They should be a little shorter than that. So this is a way to replace our in-class discussion and make it a little bit easier to get through this chapter and make sure that everything that's really important about this part of the world gets into our brains before we're done for the year and we come back in the fall. We're going to need a lot of this background information. So please watch all the way to the end and make sure you look at the list of sources. I did not take all these pictures. I did not make all these maps and graphics. These are the work of many creative people. And when someone shares their work on the internet, it's very important to give credit or at least send you to the right website to check it out for yourself. So again, this is chapter 15, North America, the Land of Opportunity. And part 1, which is the video you're watching right now, covers page 347 to page 355. If you want to follow along in your book, you can. If you do not want to follow along in your book, that is totally fine too. So let's get started. Yeah, if you weren't clear, this is the book we're using. So if this isn't your book, you're not watching the right lecture. Okay, Geography of North America. You guys know I love maps. So this is going to give you a picture how many maps I would use every day in class if I had an infinite number of walls. So North America is the name of a continent in the western hemisphere of the Earth. It is the 3rd largest continent, and there are 9,348,000 square miles of land in North America. All right, and that's divided into 23 countries. Your book will not talk about some of those countries until the next chapter. It puts the Central American countries in the same chapter as South America. That is a little bit confusing. Central America is not its own continent, so it has to go somewhere. And it's technically, officially, part of North America. But the book puts them in the next chapter because there's way more room there. No worries. The chapter is going to have a lot in it already, so it's not going to hurt us to push off those Central American countries for a little bit later. So North America is an amazing place, and I was so happy to start with you guys talking about what you already know. A whole bunch of you have done a lot of travel in North America, and that was exciting to see. Very broad variety of geographic features, and your book kind of goes through the continent from the east to the west coast, and we're going to do the same thing. So starting with what's called the Atlantic Seaboard, which is the part of the continent closest to the Atlantic Ocean. So it's between the Appalachian Mountains and the ocean. You have the actual coastal plain, and then an area called the Tidewater, and then an area called the Piedmont. And that's just layers of land getting further and further from the ocean. We start with this area because it's important. It's important because the first English-speaking settlers to come from Europe to North America went to the East Coast, right? That's where most of our history in the United States really started. It's where the people were, right? And the reason we're learning all this stuff is to learn about ourselves, where we came from, why our culture is the way it is. So that's why we focus on it. So these pictures are just sort of images of the coast. The top picture is Maine, and the bottom left is North Carolina, and then the bottom right is Florida. So that's just inland off the ocean a little bit. Well, Florida is very swampy. Okay, and next are the Appalachian Mountains. These are beautiful, interesting. This is the area where I grew up. The top right picture especially, this looks like the mountains where I was a kid. Some geologists, right, earth scientists, say the Appalachians are the oldest mountains on Earth. That's why they're soft, kind of hilly. They don't have really sharp peaks, and they're not really very tall. It's because they're worn down over a long period of time of erosion. So if you look at the map on the left side here, it should be pretty easy for you to figure out how the original 13 colonies were isolated from the rest of the continent. Why did the colonies kind of stick along the coast? Well, with this colored map, you can see, well, there's these giant mountains in the way. It's very difficult to cross them. As low and as hilly and as pretty as they are, that's a long way to go through the woods, over hill and dale, when you don't know what's on the other side of it. So the reason to understand the geography is because it helps us understand the human behavior that comes later, right? So that's our first two, the coast and then the Appalachian valleys. And we're going from the ocean toward the west. Okay, so after that would be the Central Plains. And this map, do I like maps? Can you tell? This map only colors in the United States, but the Central Plains go all the way up, all the way into Canada, basically until you run out of continent. The plains, the mountains, these features do continue on through the continent itself. They don't stop when you get to they don't need a passport, okay? They don't stop when you get to the Canadian border. We actually live right at the edge of the Great Plains, or the Central Plains, and the Gulf Plain. And so our idea of what outside looks like is a pretty good idea of what the Great Plains look like in general. It's basically flat landscape. In the southwest and in the very far north, there are places with isolated mountain ranges or little plateaus. So the bottom right picture, kind of our idea of what does the desert look like, what does the southwest look like. This is not a bad idea of a lot of the Great Plains as well, the Central Plains. However, there are places where there's lots of water. For example, the Great Lakes, which is the top right picture there. Those are part of the Central Plains as well. The Central Plains have always been flat, and during ice ages, so any time period when it gets really, really cold, which has happened throughout history, there were glaciers in this area. So sometimes the little small valleys and river pathways and lakes are formations that have come from when this area was frozen. So the last thing to notice about this map is that the Central Plains are on both sides of the Mississippi River. So pay attention to that for this whole chapter. We think of rivers, especially the Mississippi, as this very important dividing line, because that's where we draw a lot of our legal boundaries. Okay, the lines that people draw on the map are called political boundaries or legal boundaries. And we tend to draw them along rivers because it's tough for us to cross a river. Well, I'll tell you a secret. Nature doesn't care about rivers, okay? When you look at the natural division of the landscape, it pays a lot more attention to mountains than it does rivers, right? So you can see that the mountains are the boundaries of the plains, not the rivers. So we have a different perspective than the geography does. Okay, so we're still moving west. West of the Great Central Plains are the other important mountains, the Rocky Mountains. They're usually called the American Rockies. There aren't any Rockies on another continent, but they're usually called the American Rockies. And they go 3,000 miles from way up in northern Canada down into New Mexico. And the map that I chose here, the red line happens to be the peaks of the Rockies, and the Rocky Mountains form what's called the Continental Divide. So on the east side of the Continental Divide, the rivers drain into the Mississippi or into the Atlantic Ocean. And west of the Continental Divide, the rivers drain into the Pacific Ocean. When I was a kid, I thought the Continental Divide was like in the middle of the country, like an even dividing line. And no, that's not right. It also doesn't have anything to do with time zones. It doesn't line up with any political boundary, any human drawn line at all. It just doesn't. It's just where the mountains are, and that forces the rivers to go one way or the other. So that's what Continental Divide means. And I didn't get that when I was a kid. So now you know. And this picture, this is just of a river valley. An Indian encampment in a river valley in the Rockies. And this is a painting. I chose this because this is a painting, and I thought it was really beautiful. I thought it was a picture at first. This is someone's art. This is a painting. It's really amazing. And one more step. west of the Rockies, there are two very different regions. In the northern part of the United States and in Canada, the area to the left or to the west of the Rockies is called the Western Highlands. And there are more mountains, the Cascade Mountains, for example, they're shown here in these pictures. There are valleys, there are rivers. This is a really, really beautiful area of the continent. That's this northern part west of the Rockies. In the south, west of the Rockies, are deserts and arid plains. So when you hear somebody say this climate is arid, that means dry, does not get a lot of rain. So a desert is very arid. The American Southwest is not all desert, but it does have pretty much a low average rainfall. So, and the desert areas continue south into Mexico. And again, we kind of have an idea of what this looks like. We live right at the edge of it. We live at the extreme eastern edge of this great desert plateau. Your textbook does not also have a map of Mexico, but I'll go ahead and show you one here. I already mentioned Canada is basically like the lines in the United States. It just keeps on going north. You know, mountains, plains, mountains, plains. Mexico's a little bit different. The purple kind of gray color in this map is just this U-shaped set of 3 mountain ranges. And then the light, like sandy color, are dry, almost desert areas on either coast. And in the center, there's another dry area, but it's a very high altitude. And then the southern part of Mexico is basically the way we would imagine a rainforest. That's about right. It's very heavy vegetation and lots of varieties of animals, and it's hot, and it rains a lot. So I could not find a good map of Central America to go ahead and throw it in here, but it's very similar to Mexico. All of this area in Mexico between the United States and South America is these mountains are old volcanic ranges. If you remember way back at the very beginning of the book, we talked a little bit about tectonic plates and subsurface activity and volcanoes and all that kind of stuff. So Mexico and Central America are very much divided up into little areas because of these ranges of dormant volcanoes or inactive volcanoes. So it's sort of volcanic mountains and then rainforest, volcanic mountains, rainforest, all the way down. Okay, so keep going. Again, if you are following along in your book, that's great. And if you're not, no worries. So this is the next section of the chapter, how English settlement moved from east to west. So this is a very famous picture. What's happening here? We all know, right? Recognize this guy? This is Christopher Columbus landing on the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean. Now, we speak English. And I've mentioned before, why are we studying this? Why are we learning all this? We need to have an idea of the world and all of its history, but our focus is going to be on the history that goes back in a straight line from us today. Okay, so there's a lot happening other places, and we are focused on our own history. That means Christian, English speaking, you know, whatever it was that led to America. So in this case, that means we're really not going to talk about the exploration and settlement and evangelization being done by the Spanish or the French, other than just a little bit at the end. We're focused on English-speaking settlers because those are the people that will become the United States. And we are United Statesians, right? So that's the part of history that we're focused on. It's not because the other stuff is unimportant. It's because you have to pick something, and so we're going to pick our own history. Okay, so these are the first 2 English settlements in North America that have continued to exist. There were others that started and didn't succeed, or we don't really know what happened to them. These are the earliest. Everybody knows about the Pilgrims in Massachusetts in 1632. Jamestown in Virginia is actually older. Okay, Jamestown was established in 1607. Jamestown itself didn't really grow into a major settlement Williamsburg is there. It's decent size. But the big cities in Virginia are not Jamestown and Williamsburg, whereas in Massachusetts, Plymouth is basically Boston. It's very, very close to Boston. So that's part of the reason one is more famous than the other. Okay, which one had more immediate influence on the early colonies? The Pilgrims in Plymouth really were very important. The other reason we tend to care more about the Pilgrims is they were coming to the United States to escape religious persecution. And that's a huge part of how we think of ourselves as a country, as a place of freedom, a place of opportunity, like you guys mentioned in your homework. And the Jamestown settlers were just coming here because the English wanted to have a colony. Okay, so they were not coming because of persecution necessarily. They were coming to start a new life. And they were brave and admirable people, but they did not come with that that promise of freedom to worship that is so important to us. So we tend to focus on the Pilgrims, even though they weren't necessarily the very first. All right, so I keep saying 13 colonies. Let's talk about those. We're gonna divide them up into sections because that's what National Geographic did. So this is obviously a National Geographic map. And we start with the northern or New England colonies. And you have Maine, which was part of Massachusetts until the 1700s. New Hampshire, and its capital was Portsmouth, which was established in 1624. And then you have the colony of Massachusetts, the colony of Rhode Island, the colony of Connecticut. So these are the New England colonies. These are all English colonies. They're all Protestant. They're interesting people, all very much the same. These people all have what we would say a very homogenous culture. They all kind of dress the same. They all kind of talk the same. The middle colonies, okay, or some people call these the MidAtlantic colonies. The middle colonies, New York was originally a Dutch colony, but not for very long, and then the English took it over. So these, again, these are all English-speaking colonies. Pennsylvania was founded by the Quakers. Okay, so they're not Catholic, but they're really not like normal Protestants either. They were coming here because of religious persecution in Europe. The Quakers were not free to worship in England, so they did come here for that, promise of freedom reason. Whereas most everybody else on this map was coming because of the opportunity for space, for wealth, for adventure. Sometimes that's a good enough reason. And then in the southern colonies, again, all English speaking, all Protestant except for Maryland. So Maryland was actually a Catholic colony, meaning the guys that got the charter and were sent over by the king and allowed to found a colony were Catholics. Their names were Lord Calvert and Lord Baltimore. So there you go. We get a bunch of their names from these founders. Maryland is the home of the first legal document in North America that had anything to do with religious tolerance. The Catholics who founded the Maryland colony set up their government to allow other people to worship freely as well. Whereas in other colonies, it was, especially Virginia was really the worst. It was sometimes difficult or just outright dangerous to be a practicing Catholic. So in this part of the map, you've got Protestant, 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 and then the Catholic colony of Maryland. So you have Catholics in Maryland, Quakers in Pennsylvania, and pretty much everybody else in all of these English colonies are Protestants. So again, everybody kind of dresses the same, everybody kind of talks the same. Okay, so let's keep going. More maps. Do I love maps? I love my maps. These two maps show those other people that I said we weren't going to talk about. There were many people coming to North America at the same time. The French, the Spanish, the Russians were actually coming here from the other side, from the west. The French, for example, really got here first in terms of the coastlines. It was Frenchmen who were mapping the Canadian coast. They did a lot of exploring. They went inland. They also established a separate colony starting in New Orleans and working their way north as well. So the French are there. The Spanish are there in Mexico and in South America and in the Caribbean. So this kind of gives you a picture of all the people that are involved. The British are there along the coast, kind of protected from everybody else by the Appalachian Mountains. And just so we're clear, none of the people on this map had any idea just how much land they had. They didn't know what all was in it. They didn't know where their boundary really began and other people's ended. It was just a vague idea. And for example, after the United States, War of American independence is over, all that stuff. When Lewis and Clark do their exploration of the Louisiana Territory in the early 1800s, we still didn't even know how many miles across the continent was. Okay, that was still a mystery. That was something that was not figured out until they mapped it. So when we look at a map today, we think, oh wow, it's this big or that big. The people at the time did not know what we know now. It's actually really amazing what they did, even though they didn't really know where they were going or what they were doing. In the meantime, though, there's lots of fighting, lots of little battles, lots of little local wars, trying to sort that out. And obviously, in all of these places in the mix, you have the people who were here first, right? The Indians who were already here. So it's a very exciting and dangerous time to be in North America. And everywhere those explorers were going, missionaries were going too. Okay, other than in the English colonies, in the 13 English colonies, there are French and Spanish Jesuits all over the place. Okay, so the French priests, Father Marquette, Isaac Jogues, Jean de Brebeuf, Father La Salle, these men risked their lives and lost them in many cases, bringing the faith to the native people in North America. The Mississippi River was first mapped by a Jesuit. They were not just preachers, they were explorers and scientists and writers and discoverers all their own. On the West Coast, the Spanish missionaries and explorers are doing the same thing. Some of the Spanish were Franciscans and some of them were Jesuits. They were coming up from Mexico. There aren't as many stories of brutal martyrdoms and torture, but their lives are also very difficult and very sacrificial, very interesting. So again, a lot of things are happening that we're not taking the time to study, and that's fine. You can't do it all. We could spend our whole lives talking about each one of these pictures. So we certainly are, we're just getting an overview of it right now. So again, we're going to talk about our English-speaking colonies, and pretty soon that's going to mean we're basically just talking about the United States. I'm sure you're all fine with that. So, growth in the English colonies was all along the coast except for this one pathway. It was called the Wilderness Road. It wasn't really a road. When the English-speaking settlers started to run out of space, and not really run out of space, but just keep continuously looking for new opportunities, they would pay explorers, and they called them frontiersmen, to go west and seek a path. And basically what they did was they'd say, here, I want you to find me 20 acres and I will pay you half of them. So you find 20 acres and I get 10 and you get 10. So I hope this doesn't disappoint you, but the guy in the picture is Daniel Boone. That's the actual Daniel Boone. So sorry, no coonskin cap. Hope that's okay with you. People like Daniel Boone would go from the East Coast out into this interior, into Tennessee and Kentucky and places like this, and explore and survey and map and mark land for people who wanted to come west. And so Daniel Boone became wealthy, for example, because he ended up getting a lot of land. This is also how George Washington got wealthy. Was by being a surveyor, by going out into the west, crossing the Appalachians, and drawing maps and doing surveys and helping people get more land out in this unexplored area. Your surveyor, your frontiersman guy, would get paid in land as well, which they would then sell if they didn't want to live on it, they would then sell it and make all this money. Okay, so you can see on the map, they're coming down. The Great Valley Road is on the left or west side of the Shenandoah Mountains. That's in the of the Appalachian Mountains. It's the Shenandoah Valley, sorry. And then at Roanoke, you have to kind of cross the mountains. There's a little bit of a gap, and then you take the Wilderness Road west to a place called the Cumberland Gap, which sends you out into the plains of Middle Tennessee or central. And the map is showing going to Kentucky. So that's that. But trouble is brewing. Ha, get it? Tea is brewing. Okay, anyway. I'm going to stop there to keep this less than half an hour. So this is just the first part of the chapter. Next time we will talk about the early history of the United States. So we'll talk about the middle part of the chapter. And then there's a third video to finish it out, the Civil War and stuff. So we're stopping now at the end of Into the West. So I'm stopping on like page 357-ish. So if you've been reading along and you get to the colonies go to war, it's time to stop. And we'll pick this up next time. So I mentioned at the end, this time I'm going to go ahead and say it. Make sure you look at this list. These are places that I got photographs or maps or double-checked facts. If I added something that wasn't in your textbook, this is where I got it. Okay. And these are sources that it would be safe for you to use for your own research if you chose to. Okay, so sit here for a minute if you need to pause it and write something down. And if not, I will see you in the part 2 video. We'll talk about the founding of the United States.